Hi, everyone that is joining. Welcome to this webinar. We're just going to get started in a minute's time, so do bear with us. But in the meantime, if you'd like to say hello, please pop down where you're from in the chat, and if it's an appropriate time of day, if you're drinking any wine as well, feel free to share whatever you are drinking, and we'll get started just in a moment. Hi, Milos, how is it going? Welcome.
How cold is it in Helsinki at the minute?
Yeah, well done. A glass of Fino Sherry in Helsinki at this
Oh.
time of year. Well done to you. Buenos Aires, welcome. It's at 5 degrees, fair enough.
Yeah,
Hi,
actually,
Swell.
probably I was thinking it was going to be much colder than that, so
Yeah, there you go. It's
could be
perfect.
worse.
Perfect weather. Right, Emma, should we get started?
Sure thing.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by the WSET School London in association with Discover Australia. My name is Sam Povey. I'm an educator at the school, and I'm joined this evening by Emma Symington MW, who many of you will know from previous webinars. Emma has worked in various roles in the wine trade for the last 15 years. She's now the Education Development Manager for Wine Australia's EMEA region, and is, as you might have noticed from her post-nominals, an MW as well. So we're very pleased to have you here, Emma, this evening. Without further ado, I will pass over to Emma. But if you do have any questions at all during the evening, please put them in the Q&A box. So not in the chat, but in the Q&A box. If they've already been answered by Emma, I'll maybe be answering them myself. But otherwise, Emma can answer them during the presentation or at the end. So, Emma, thank you for joining us, and I will hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sam, and good evening. Hello, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining me again for another of these Discover Australia webinars. And today we are focusing on two cool climate regions in Australia, Yarra Valley and Mornington Peninsula. So as Sam said, my name is Emma Symington. I'm a Master of Wine and I work for Wine Australia, based in the UK and covering UK, Europe, and theoretically Africa. And I look after education for Wine Australia. Now, just before we get into the actual webinar, I just wanted to draw your attention to our education resources, which is australianwinediscovered.com, as you can see in front of you. This is a website we set up a few years ago, and it really is your one-stop shop for anything you could want to learn about Australian wine. There's, I think, 28 modules on there now, covering all the key regions, varieties. There's broader topics like sparkling wine, old vines, organics and biodynamics. And each of the modules has study guides, video content, there's quizzes, there's PowerPoint presentations, there's all sorts of information there. So if you are studying for your WSET exams, this really is your one-stop shop for anything you'd want to know about Australia. So do make a note of that because I think you'll find it really useful. So today, as I said, we're looking at two regions in particular, Yarra Valley and Mornington Peninsula, both down in Victoria. We'll be talking about their geography, their climate and soil, so what makes them special, what gives them their wine characteristics, and then looking at the prominent grape varieties and wines, obviously, that come out of these regions. Okay, so many of you will have seen this map before, but just a quick reminder about, firstly, the size of Australia. Of course, it is one country, but as I often say, it's a continent-sized country, so it is bigger than Europe in terms of scale. It's a vast, vast country. And as you can see, there's 65 different wine regions spread across the southern part of Australia. And as I said, we are focusing down in the state of Victoria, which is in the southern part and towards the east of Australia. And as you can see, there's 21 different wine regions in Victoria, primarily relatively small regions in terms of production. And in total, the state of Victoria only accounts for about 13% of total production in Australia. So relatively small and primarily small boutique wineries. As you can see, we're focused on these two regions just outside Melbourne, so in the centre, southern part of the state of Victoria. So we're going to start firstly talking about Yarra Valley. Now, the Yarra Valley, as you can see, is quite a large region, just due east of Melbourne. It's about 45 kilometres outside of the city of Melbourne, so about an hour's drive. It was actually the first region planted in Victoria back in 1838, and it's got quite a rich viticultural history, but it has also had the chance to start afresh because in terms of modern plantings, everything is quite recent. I'll just explain a little bit more about that history in a bit more depth now. So as I said, the first plantings in Victoria were in the Yarra Valley. That was back in 1838 by, as you can see here, some Scottish-born brothers. But then interestingly, through the middle part of that 19th century, it was actually some Swiss winemakers who came over to Australia, settled in the Yarra Valley, and really started things moving in terms of winemaking. And quite quickly, it became a popular wine region, and a lot of people thought very highly of it in terms of its production. But this early sort of golden era of the Yarra Valley ended quite abruptly around about the turn of the 20th century. This is for a number of reasons. Firstly, because there was an economic depression at the time. There was also a move domestically in Australia towards drinking more fortified wines. And as a cool climate wine region, fortified wines are really not what the Yarra Valley is best known for. And all of this came together, resulting in vineyards being ripped out. So by 1921, all viticulture had ceased in the region and people moved across to other sorts of horticulture and agriculture, and primarily actually dairy farming. And then it wasn't until sort of towards the end of the 20th century that people started planting grapevines again and making wine again. So the first vines were planted back in 1963, and then the first vintage, as you can see here, was in 1973. That was at Yarra Yering, which is now quite a famous winery within the Yarra Valley. And then towards the end of the 20th century and really up to now, more and more focus, I think, has been put on Yarra Valley. It's a region that has become quite popular, both in terms of with winemakers in Australia and also in terms of from consumers for drinking the wine. I think this move towards more cool climate viticulture and a drive for these styles which are fresher and more elegant has really led some of this demand. But today it's still pretty small in terms of production, just over 2,000 hectares. So not a huge amount of production, and it really is still dominated by small family-owned boutique wineries. It's also probably one of the key regions that's driven a real renaissance for Pinot Noir down in Australia. And this is partly because I think the region has been a bit of a hotbed of creativity. Lots of experimentation in terms of winemaking. So particularly with Pinot Noir, it's a region, this is where one of the regions where people really started experimenting with things like whole bunch fermentation with Pinot Noir, and more latterly with Shiraz and Syrah too. So lots of experimentation, lots of innovation, and this is what makes it a really exciting region. So this is a topographical map, as you can see there at Yarra Valley, just to give you a little bit more insight into what the region looks like. And this is a map we've created using remote satellite imaging software. And it also nicely shows you exactly where the vineyards are. So these dark green splodges you can see on the map are actually where the vineyard sites are within the Yarra Valley. So looking at this map, you can see it is quite a large region in terms of area, but as you can see, very small in terms of actual plantings. As I said, just over 2,000 hectares in total, and fairly sporadically throughout that central part of the region. Now, what you can also see on here is that it is just one region. There's no official sub-regions within the Yarra Valley. But if you go over there and talk to the winemakers and viticulturalists, they'll often refer to the lower Yarra and the upper Yarra as kind of two unofficial sub-regions. And the way you can look at this is if you can, I hope you can see my pointer on here, if you can see this highway running down from the northwest to kind of the southeast, everything north and west of here is the lower Yarra. So this is the lower part of the Yarra River. And everything south and east of here is the upper Yarra. So this is the upper part of the Yarra River. And generally the lower Yarra, so this section down here, These are these lower lying vineyard sites. So these are sort of 30, 50 meters in terms of elevation. So these are the warmer sites within the Yarra Valley. The upper Yarra, so all the way up down here, this is the higher site. So here you're heading up to over 400 meters in terms of elevation. So there's a real big difference in terms of elevation over the Yarra Valley. And this relates to almost 3 to 4 weeks difference in terms of picking dates between those warmer lower Yarra sites and those cooler upper Yarra Valley sites. So quite a big difference in terms of climate. Overall, the Yarra Valley is often described as having a climate that is cooler than Bordeaux, but warmer than Burgundy. But as you can see, given what I've just said about that variation in terms of elevation within the region, there's a lot more diversity and differentiation than that one simple statement says. So those warmer sites down in the lower Yarra, this is where you get Cabernet Sauvignon planted. There's a bit of Shiraz. There's also things like Sangiovese, Nebbiolo. So those red grape varieties. In the upper Yarra, so those cooler, much higher altitude sites, this is really where Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are absolutely dominant. And this is not just for still wine made of those grape varieties, but also for traditional method sparkling wine. And again, that should give you an idea of just how cool some of those sites are. Now, in terms of climate, the other important thing to talk about with the Yarra Valley is the fact that it's got two kind of ranges of hills that influence it. So up to the north, this section up here, this is the bottom of the Great Dividing Range. Now, if you've done some of these Discover Australia webinars before, you'll probably have heard me talk about the Great Dividing Range. So it's a big range of mountains which runs right down the eastern seaboard of Australia and then curls in towards the northern part of Victoria, ending kind of due west of Melbourne. So quite an important range of mountains. And it's quite important for the Yarra Valley because it protects the Yarra Valley from any of the hot northerly winds that come down from that hot centre of Australia. So it absolutely protects the valley from those hot northerly winds. And then what you have to the south of the Yarra Valley down here is the Dandenong Ranges. And together, hopefully you can see, these create this kind of amphitheatre, which kind of encompasses the valley. And then you get these cold breezes that come from the southwest, off the ocean, so off that cold southern ocean. They blow into the Yarra Valley and then they're trapped by that amphitheatre of hills and mountains. So that's keeping that cold air in the valley and really exacerbating that cool climate influence and effect of that cooling breezes from the ocean. So again, this is another quite important influence on the climate in the Yarra Valley. So overall, the climate in the Yarra Valley, and particularly as you head further east, is getting a bit continental. But as I say, you do get those maritime influences from those breezes, and particularly because it's trapped by those ranges of hills and mountains. And as I said, there's quite big variation in terms of altitude within the valley, which is giving you quite a lot of variation in terms of microclimates in different vineyard sites, meaning a lot of different grape varieties can be planted in the valley. So just a couple of images to give you an idea of what the Yarra looks like. And it really is a stunningly beautiful region. As you can imagine, you've got these, this lovely range of hills surrounding the valley and the vineyards, gradually moving up into those hills. It really is a beautiful place to visit. And then this is an image, obviously, in the winter. As you can see, pruning hasn't quite finished yet there. So this is an early morning photo, just showing that layer of fog. Again, that influence from the ocean, pulling in this cold air and giving that layer of fog. And you can see on the ground here a bit of a sprinkling of frost, again, giving an indication of how cool this region is. Now, in terms of soil types in the Yarra Valley, there's two quite distinct soil types, and they kind of relate to those two unofficial subregions I was talking about. So the northern part of the Yarra, which is the lower Yarra, as I was saying, those lower lying sites, this is very ancient soils. This is soils that have come off the Great Dividing Range, pretty low in fertility, free draining and clay loam kind of subsoils. The southern side, on the other hand, of the Yarra Valley, so those higher altitude vineyards, this is much younger soil based on volcanic soils, as you can see, much more fertile. So again, this is giving that differentiation across the region, not only in terms of elevation, but also in terms of soil types. Okay, here's a little graph to give you an indication of the top 5 grape varieties grown in the Yarra Valley. And you can see quite clearly looking at this that really it is absolutely dominated by Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, accounting for nearly 70% between them in terms of plantings. And as I said, primarily this is up in those higher elevation, higher altitude sites in the upper Yarra. And making some really beautiful wines from both of these grape varieties, both as still wines and also as sparkling wines. But interestingly, and I suppose historically, the Yarra Valley was actually best known for Cabernet Sauvignon. This is going back into, the very early history of the Yarra Valley, but also in terms of those first plantings that happened back in the 1970s, 60s and 70s. Cabernet Sauvignon is really what started people becoming interested in Yarra Valley again. And Yarra Valley Cabernet Sauvignon is absolutely beautiful, very much that cool climate style. You often get this kind of herbaceous note running through it, but really some absolutely stellar wines coming out of Cabernet, coming out of the Yarra Valley from Cabernet Sauvignon. Shiraz, of course, also on the list, but very much made in that cool climate, more restrained, more medium-bodied, more savoury style than from some of the warmer regions in Australia. And then, as you can see, Pinot Gris, but there's also many alternative grape varieties, as I mentioned, now planted in the Yarra Valley too. You've got a selection of some of them here in front of you. Mornay, Gewürztraminer, Grüne Veltliner, Pinot Meunier. Some of that, of course, will be used in sparkling wine as well. Gamay, a lot of people getting quite excited about Gamay in the Yarra Valley now. Braccetto, Tempranillo, Sangiovese, Nebbiolo. There's also quite a bit of Trousseau, quite a bit. There's a bit of Trousseau, so a Jura grape variety now planted in Yarra Valley. So all sorts of exciting things happening there. As I said, this is a region where there's, a lot of younger winemakers, a lot of innovation, a lot of experimentation. Of course, on one hand in terms of winemaking, but also in terms of trying new grape varieties, sort of pushing the boundaries, experimenting, and, trying new things. So that in the nutshell is the Yarra Valley. And then if we move to the Mornington Peninsula, so as you can see, we haven't gone very far in terms of distance. Mornington, again, is just outside Melbourne. It's about an hour's drive again and due south here. Now, looking at the history of the Mornington Peninsula, similar in some ways to Yarra Valley. So there were some early vineyards planted in the late 1800s, but again, like the Yarra Valley, because of economic depression and various other issues, viticulture ceased. And it didn't restart until the 1970s. So again, it's got quite a recent history in terms of what is actually in the ground today in the Mornington Peninsula. And today it's a pretty small region really in terms of production. There's only about 50 wineries, more growers on top of that, but only about 50 wineries and just about 1,000 hectares in terms of actual planting. So just under half of what is in the Yarra Valley. Now, Mornington Peninsula is a beautiful region. As I said, it's just south of Melbourne. It's a peninsula, so it's surrounded on 3 sides by the ocean. So, of course, lots of beaches. And because it's just outside Melbourne, it's a region where there's, a lot of people have second homes. There's lots of tourism in terms of hotels and golf courses and so on. And what this all leads to is some pretty high land prices. So this is one of the reasons why Mornington has been kept as a very small, quite a boutique wine region, is because those land prices are particularly high in this region. That does also, of course, mean that it's a great region to visit because there's lots to see and do. And pretty much all of the wineries have, you know, beautiful cellar doors and restaurants and cafes and so on. So it's a great place to go as a wine tourist. Okay, so this is, again, that topographical map of the region of the Mornington Peninsula. So as I said, surrounded on three sides by the ocean. So unsurprisingly, that maritime influence is absolutely key when it comes to Mornington Peninsula, in terms of its characteristics, in terms of its climate, and in terms, of course, of the styles of wines that are made there. So absolutely strongly influenced by the ocean. So this has got a really cooling influence on Mornington Peninsula, remembering that this ocean that really surrounds Mornington is the Southern Ocean. So it's a very, very cold ocean. Those waters come up from Antarctica. So a very important cooling influence. And then typically Mornington is also quite windy. So you either get winds from the south, so from off the ocean, or from the north, which come across Port Phillip Bay. So either way, these winds are coming off bodies of water, so they're having that cooling influence right across the peninsula. Again, as you can see, not a huge amount in terms of plantings, as I said, just under 1,000 hectares, and fairly sporadically dotted around the region. And hopefully you can just about pick out this area of elevation, which is a kind of ridge down the central part of Mornington Peninsula. So this is known as Red Hill, and it is the area of elevation in the centre of the peninsula. So as you head north towards Melbourne, so up here, you're getting down to pretty much sea level in terms of elevation, so very low. But up on Red Hill, up the hill, as they say, on the peninsula, you're heading up to about 200, 250 metres in terms of altitude. So again, this is giving that difference in elevation, that extra cooling influence when you're up the hill versus those slightly warmer sites as you head down the hill. So as I said, overall in terms of climate, this is a true maritime climate. So that means there's not a huge diurnal variation in Mornington. So it's never going to get very warm in the daytime, but it's also not going to get super cold at night. And you see that around the year as well. So similarly, it's not hot in the summer and it's not cold in winter. It's got a relatively even heat distribution because of that moderating influence of the ocean. So true maritime climate. And again, as I said, that smaller than the Yarra Valley, but absolute difference in terms of elevation. So again, those higher altitude sites will be picked 2 to 3 weeks later than those lower lying sites towards the north of the region. Pretty diverse, again, in terms of soil types across the region. So those down the hill sites, so those lower lying sites towards the north of the region, typically have slightly poorer sedimentary soils. So these are the warmer and drier sites. And then up the hill, so up on Red Hill, these are slightly deeper, more fertile, younger soils. And those are the cooler and also much windier sites up the hill. So looking at the top 5 varieties for Mornington Peninsula, well, the top 2, pretty similar to Yarra Valley, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but here Pinot Noir is absolutely dominant. And unlike Yarra Valley, this will primarily be for still wine, so certainly not as much sparkling wine made as on Mornington Peninsula as in Yarra Valley, but really beautiful wines made from both Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Pinots, if you're looking specifically at that, the ones from down the hills, those slightly warmer sites, they're going to be a little bit richer, a little bit more red and black fruited, I suppose, in terms of flavour, whereas those sites which are up Red Hill tend to be a little bit more restrained, perhaps a little bit more structured in terms of tannin and acidity, but either way, they're absolutely beautiful wines coming out of Pinot from Mornington Peninsula. Third variety is Pinot Gris. Now, Mornington Peninsula is probably Australia's top region for Pinot Gris. It seems to have really just found a happy home in Mornington Peninsula. That maritime, cool climate really seems to suit Pinot Gris down under. Some people very much making it in that slightly richer, broader Pinot Gris style. Other people will be making it in that sort of fruitier, lighter style of Pinot Grigio. Of course, you can label it as either in Australia, but it does give you an idea of what to expect in the bottle. There is still a bit of Shiraz in Mornington Peninsula, again made in that much more cool climate, restrained, savoury style, so quite different for some of the warmer regions in Australia, and then a bit of Sauvignon Blanc and other alternative grape varieties there too. Okay, I think that was a quick overview of the two regions. So if anyone has any particular questions, I will have a look.
Emma, yeah, there are a couple. And just a reminder, everyone, if you can put your questions in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. I see a couple of people just popping them in the chat. Pop them in the Q&A box. It helps us organize them. Yes, Emma, there was a question from Reese asking if you can recommend any particular producers in the Mornington Peninsula that we should look out for.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, frankly, you're not going to go wrong with any producer in the Mornington Peninsula. As I said, these are all pretty small, you know, boutique family-owned companies, all making high-quality premium wine. So really, you can't go wrong. That being said, some of my favourites, one of them is 10 Minutes by Tractor. You may have heard of. Partly I love it because of the name. So it was set up with 3 different vineyards actually up the hill. And they were all 10 minutes away from each other by tractor, hence the name. But they make some absolutely stunning Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Stonier, they're down the hill, so a slightly different style in terms of Pinots, but again, making some really delicious wines. Muraduck is another one. As I said, I could go on, but there are so many really beautiful wineries there in that particular region.
Absolutely difficult to choose from. A couple more questions. A question here from John Brooks. Are there any other varieties, perhaps those that aren't planted, that you think could work well either in Yarra or in the Mornington Peninsula?
Oh, so many, I'm sure. And probably many of them are being experimented with at the minute. So Australia, I think because there's no laws around what can and can't be planted anywhere, and because the Aussies always have this kind of drive to improve, drive to experiment and innovate, there's more than 150 different grape varieties planted in Australia today, and there's always more coming in. So I know, for example, Nerello Mascalese, so a Sicilian red grape variety, is just arriving for the first time in Australia. It takes about 7 years to get a new grape variety through quarantine, so it's a long process. But there is this real interest, I think, from the growers and from the winemakers in Australia to try new things. So really, these two regions, I think any grape variety that comes from a cooler climate, you know, wherever else in the world it's come from, frankly, would be interesting to experiment with there.
And that was just quite an interesting comment you made there. It takes 7 years to get a grape variety or vine through quarantine. Would you like to explain a little bit about why that is?
Yeah, for sure. So I suppose a lot of this goes back to almost the end of the 1800s because of phylloxera. So, of course, I'm sure you're all well aware of what happened in Europe with phylloxera towards the end of the 1800s. Well, what happened actually at the same time is phylloxera entered into Victoria towards the end of the 1800s. And the South Australian government at the time, I think, had this real foresight and realised what a problem this could be. So they instigated very, very strict quarantine laws at that point, both in terms of bringing new material into the country and also across state boundaries. And these kind of very strict quarantine laws really have stayed there to this day. So if you want to bring new vine material into Australia, it goes into quarantine for a number of years, and then, you know, has to go into proper regulated nurseries for more years to be propagated on. And only after all testing in terms of that it's free from virus and any other problems, only at that point is it then allowed to be sold and planted out into vineyards. So it is a real process, but it has kept, well, all of South Australia phylloxera free and a number of regions elsewhere in Australia too. So Mornington is phylloxera free. Yarra Valley, I could have said earlier. Yarra Valley is an interesting one because phylloxera arrived there back in 2006, so not long ago at all. So parts of the region of Yarra Valley have phylloxera and parts are at risk of phylloxera. So there's a really big conversation happening in Yarra Valley at the minute with people, deciding when they're going to be ripping up vines and then replanting on grafted rootstock, but also taking the opportunity to perhaps consider whether what is currently placed in those vineyards is what is best suited for them, looking at things like row orientation, looking at things like, of course, choice of rootstock. So it really is a big conversation in the Yarra Valley, and is again driving change, I think.
Fantastic. It's absolutely fascinating that these questions are still alive even today for
Absolutely.
arrived quite a long time ago. Right, we've got a few more questions to get through, and then we probably move on to the Great Southern. Mark Paul asks, and I believe this is in reference to the Yarra Valley. The map that you showed displays more vineyards in the lower valley, but the higher percentage of wines seem to be from the upper valley. Can you potentially comment on that?
Go back. Yes. So I suppose in terms of the original plantings in the Yarra Valley, so I mean the modern day original plantings, this is 1960s, 70s, 80s, it was all primarily in this kind of central part of the Yarra Valley. So this is why there's still a lot of vineyards there. What's happening more recently is there's been a real push up into the Upper Yarra, and people are continually planting new vineyards there. But it is much more recent. I'm talking probably in the last 10, perhaps 20 years, but certainly no longer than that. So I think in time, we will see more vineyards planted in the Upper Yarra because of that interest in Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, because of that move to cooler sites. But there are still all, of course, those plantings down in the Lower Yarra too. And I should say there's certainly Chardonnay and things down in the Lower Yarra, less Pinot. Pinot tends to be up in the Upper Yarra. But Chardonnay down there, still very much made in a cool climate style, but a little bit richer than perhaps some of those styles from in the Upper Yarra.
Okay, fantastic. And a question from Milos in Finland. He asks, thinking of the history of the Yarra Valley, are there still sweet wines being produced today?
Oh, great question. Certainly not something I've ever come across. That's not to say it doesn't happen, because there's always exceptions to the rule. But no, I mean really, the production is centered on still wine and a bit of sparkling wine. Yeah.
Fair enough. Maybe if sherry comes roaring back into popularity, I'm sure the Australian winemakers will change their minds. Okay, a couple more questions, and Emma, do let me know when you think we need to
of course.
on. Izzy asks, would you say that the Shiraz from Mornington Peninsula is similar to the style that you might find in the Northern Rhone?
Yes, I'd say more similar to the Northern Rhone than perhaps something from Barossa Valley or McLaren Vale, one of those warmer climate sites in Australia. So yes, you have that more medium body kind of style, that more savoury element that you get from the Northern Rhone, a bit more tannin, and occasionally that kind of meaty, smoky note, which I often associate with Northern Rhone too. So yes, I think there are similarities there. That's not to say you'd necessarily blind taste a Mornington wine and think it was from the Northern Rhone. You may not. But yes, I think in terms of benchmarking, that's probably a nice way to look at it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And Bruno, on a slightly different note, asks if we find the production of any sparkling wine on the Mornington Peninsula.
Mornington.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, or indeed the Yarra Valley.
Yes, certainly in the Yarra Valley, there's quite a lot of sparkling wine made, again, from those higher sites. There's a number of wineries actually that really specialise in sparkling wine. But yeah, less so in the Mornington. I think that more maritime climate in the Mornington is less suited to sparkling wine production, whereas particularly these higher sites in the Yarra Valley, you do have that element of continentality, and it seems to be really well suited to sparkling wine production.
Sounds lovely. Kelly asks, are the wines from I'm assuming Yarra and Mornington, are they mainly varietal, or is there blending of grape varieties? Is the blending of grape varieties commonplace?
So certainly when it comes to Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, they'd absolutely be single varietal. When it comes to Cabernet, though, particularly in this, I'm talking about the Yarra Valley, it's often blended with a bit of Merlot, a bit of Cabernet Franc, perhaps even a bit of Malbec. So, those classic Bordeaux style varieties were all planted here back in the 70s and often are blended. But I'd say most of the other grape varieties are going to be single varietal.
Fantastic. Okay, a few more questions. Again, please let me know when you'd like to move on to Great Southern and if we have
Oh
time.
no, we're not. No, Great Southerns next time, Sam.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. Yes, you're quite right. Mark asks, how widespread are organic and biodynamic practices in Victoria?
Oh, great question. I don't have any real stats on that, I'm afraid. For example, I know McLaren Vale in South Australia, it's almost 40% of all plantings are certified organic and biodynamic. That's just something the region is really hot on, and they have those stats. I don't think those stats exist actually for Yarra and Mornington, so I can't tell you specifically. That being said, I think given the sort of how small the production is in these regions and knowing the care that is taken in the vineyard sites, I imagine it's, and there are certainly a number of people working, I'd say more organically than biodynamically. But I think, a lot of people are working very much in that sense and also sustainably too.
Absolutely. It's always a frustrating thing to try and find out the statistics on these
It really is.
in many wine regions. Okay, we've got a great question from Alan. Alan is fortunate enough to be visiting Victoria later this year. He only has enough time to visit one wine region. So the question is, should you visit the Yarra Valley or the Mornington Peninsula if you had to choose?
Oh gosh, I mean, you're not going to go wrong in either location, to be honest. And because they're both so easy to visit outside of Melbourne, personally, I'd probably choose the Yarra Valley. I just think it's so beautiful with all the hills around it. But really, you're not going to go wrong either region. You're going to try some amazing wines. There's amazing restaurants in both regions. You'll have an amazing time. I'm very jealous.
Yes, I am as well, Alan. Have a great time in Victoria. Letitia asks, are there any wine events or festivals that visitors should look out for, particularly in the Yarra Valley, that might showcase the wine produced?
I actually honestly don't know. I'm certain there will be, particularly being just outside Melbourne. It's obviously such a huge draw to come into the Yarra Valley. I don't know particularly, but certainly, there's Yarra Valley Wine Growers. They've got a website and there'll be information on there if you want to have a look there.
Great, fantastic. And a couple of questions actually just about the sparkling wine, particularly in Yarra. Svel asks, could you describe a sort of a typical profile of the sparkling wine that we might find in the valley?
Yeah, I mean, it's traditional method. So, similar to traditional methods from other cool climate sparkling wine regions from around the world. Primarily Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, a little bit of Pinot Meunier, but it's going to be primarily Chardonnay Pinot. Some producers will be dominant in one, some will be dominant in the other. There's also certainly Blanc de Blanc produced there too. But it is made very much in that cool climate, traditional sparkling method style. So, bright acidity, fine bubbles, time on lees, autolysis, the whole lot, really. There's, as I said, really some delicious wines made from sparkling wines in the Yarra Valley.
Yeah, say having tried sort of several myself, they're absolutely delicious. John is asking if you were going to be tasting a Pinot Noir blind, how would you identify it as coming from the Yarra Valley compared to, I suppose, somewhere like California, for example?
Great question. Blind tasting is always a tricky thing, isn't it? In terms of Yarra Pinot, I always find it has this lovely kind of raspberry scented kind of fruit, so that absolute red fruit profile, beautiful acidity. It often producers in the Yarra use a bit of whole bunch, so that's giving you that extra tannin structure, but also that kind of herbaceous lift to Pinot. So if you're picking out a bit of that whole bunch, it can be a pointer from Yarra Valley. For example, Mornington Peninsula producers tend to use far less whole bunch than they do in Yarra Valley. So it can be a good pointer in that sense. But yeah, it's just that really elegant, beautiful, lovely textured style of Pinot Noir, and that lovely lift that kind of blossoms out of the glass.
Absolutely. Just a couple more questions. Annie is wondering, what kind of price range can we expect wines from the Yarra or the Mornington Peninsula to show up on our shelves at?
Oh, great question. So Yarra, I mean, I don't think you're going to be getting much under £10 a bottle in the UK. You know, these are premium, as I said, small producer regions, and you're going to be going up from there. Mornington, you're probably starting a little bit higher than that, to be honest. As I said, this is a region with very high land prices, so high input costs for producers, and again, making in very small quantities. So Mornington, I think you'd be hard pressed to get much below £15 a bottle, particularly if we're looking at Chardonnay and Pinot, and again going up from there.
Absolutely. And Rob wants to ask a little bit about export stress. Obviously, in the recent past, Australia's had a little bit of a tough time, particularly exporting wine to China. Has either the Yarra Valley or the Mornington Peninsula suffered from that sort of turbulence?
I think both of these regions really benefit from being so close to Melbourne. So they have such a strong domestic market that actually there's not a huge amount available for export in the first place. And because of these kind of cool climate styles, these are wines that are really sought for in different export markets. Certainly here in the UK, you know, these are the sort of wines you'll find, you know, on top restaurant wine lists, in independent wine merchants, and in other export markets around the world. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a number of wine regions in Australia that are having problems at the minute in terms of exports, and, you know, just generally dealing with, you know, decreasing wine drinking that's happening globally, and that is affecting, you know, wine regions from around the world, frankly. But I think Yarra and Mornington, because of where they're positioned and because of the sort of styles of wine they're making, they don't have as much of an impact.
Understandable. Okay, I think that looks like, thank you for going through a quick fire round of questions there. There's just one that snuck into the chat. Jürgen asks if there's a specific difference between Chardonnay from Margaret River versus Chardonnay from areas like the Yarra Valley.
Well, funny you should say that, Jürgen, because that actually brings me on to talking about the next Discover Australia session on the 30th of April, when we'll be talking about Margaret River and Great Southern as two regions over in Western Australia. I will talk about it much more in that session, but yes, Margaret River Chardonnay tends to be a bit more powerful, a bit more concentrated, have a bit more body to it, whereas Yarra and Mornington tend to be that more elegant, restrained style. But yeah, tune in next time and you'll hear a lot more about Margaret River Chardonnay then.
And just a reminder that a recording of this webinar will be available from tomorrow on our YouTube channel, but you'll also receive an email when it's been uploaded. Well, in that case, I think it just leaves me to say thank you, Emma, so much for giving us some of your evening, and thank you all who joined for the webinar. We hope to see you next time at the next Discover Australia webinar, or indeed in the school itself. And Emma, you're hosting a tasting of the iconic wines of Australia at the school on the 2nd of May. That's not to be missed.
I'm really excited about that. We're going to have an amazing lineup. So yes, I don't think tickets are available yet, Sam, but when they are, if you want to come along, get them quickly, because I don't think they'll last long.
Please do keep an eye out, and of course sign up to our newsletter, our events newsletter, to be the first to hear about that tasting when tickets are released. But thank you all for joining us. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are joining us from. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.